Welcome to a Listen to Learn episode of the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm speaking with Julia Starr. Julia, say hello.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, and that's Julia Starr with two R's, Starr with a double R. Recently, I got active on TikTok. I'd kind of been resisting it for a while. Julia is a TikTok star, so she's already posting on there and doing clips, and I stumbled across her because I was posting some clips about constructive development theory, and I hit that hashtag and I was like, oh, I wonder if anyone else is doing stuff, and she happens to be one of those. If you're not familiar with constructive development theory, we'll talk a little bit about that, but essentially the simple version of that is it's a framework for understanding how people, and particularly adults, grow and mature through their life. And so Julia is a leadership and career coach. She helps high-achieving professionals who feel stuck gain clarity and confidence as they pivot into a vocational path that is in greater alignment with their strengths and values. So in this discussion, we're going to talk about that in the lens of constructive development theory, but we're going to specifically focus on the part of it that is inside out oriented. And so we're going to discuss how successfully architecting a career or business in life that fulfills us, to do that requires that we have a deep understanding of ourselves. And so we're going to talk about that inside out development. So Julia, to get us started, what is constructive development and how does it help us understand how adults grow?
Yes. So I'll try to make this easy and digestible. I'm sure we'll get into it further, but constructive development theory, otherwise known as CDT, is really a theory of how adult psychology evolves throughout our lives. And so prior to CDT and all of the research that was done on can adults continue to develop, essentially was the initial question, or like, are we kind of stuck? Like once the prefrontal cortex is formed, like, are we just done, or is there more to be had? CDT says there is more development and evolution that adults can experience over time. And how CDT defines it is through this lens of what's called meaning making. And so it really shows us how through lived experience, adults can change what meaning they're making about the world and about themselves in the world. And it's a framework to see where you might be on, they almost have this hierarchical path that distinguishes different stages of development through adulthood.
Yeah. So like if you were to just, we're going to kind of focus on a part of that journey. There's these 5 different stages, and the third stage is called the socialized mind, or level 3, depending on who's writing about it. And then the fourth is maybe a phrase that people have heard more often, is the idea of being self-authored. So kind of dive a little bit deeper into those two and how they interact and what's the difference between them, and then kind of introduce the idea of inside out versus outside in.
Yeah. So to your point, so stage 3 is the socialized mind, and that's where most of us spend, the majority of our adulthoods. And what it means is that we're creating meaning based on the social group that we're a part of. So, for example, if you are an Episcopalian, like random example, that's our religion if people aren't familiar with it, you would create your identity based on that association with a social group, a set of norms, a set of behaviors and values. And so you're understanding yourself through that social group. The self-authored stage, which is stage 4, is where you kind of intuitively, based on the name, you're creating meaning about yourself in the world more from your own internal kind of locus of control. You're taking information in, and then you're deciding on your own what meaning that has for you, rather than kind of eliminating that step of reflection and just accepting it as, oh, if they believe that, then I believe that. There's that kind of pause of, what do I think about this? And then you can go back into the world, taking from it what you find to be true, and then leaving things that, for whatever reason, through your lived experience, you don't resonate with.
Yeah. For people that aren't familiar with the theory, you might have heard of the idea of like a midlife transition, or maybe in a movie, like a midlife crisis. So the transition from 3 to 4 tends to sort of encapsulate that. So how would you connect that maybe more colloquial idea to the transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people start to realize that they don't have to take on all the beliefs of the groups that they've affiliated themselves with, it can lead to somewhat of an unraveling. And it can put you into what people describe as this existential crisis, where it's like, is anything true? Like, I think it can really, you know, challenge you and challenge the foundation that you've been standing on, because we operate in the world through making meaning. Like, I go
Yeah.
into a coffee shop and I see a barista smile at me and I say, okay, this is a friendly person, like there's all these conclusions that we're coming to about the world that we're in. But if you have a challenging experience to that of like, oh, they smiled at me, do they want something from me? Like there's so
Mm-hmm.
many different ways to interpret what's happening to you every single day,
Mm-hmm.
that it can, yeah, to the midlife crisis, if you've oriented yourself to the world through these assumptions from your social groups, like that's a pretty easy, stress-free way to be, to a degree. And then when you get
Yeah.
into the self-authored space, it's like, oh, I need to be more thoughtful. I need to be with myself. And this, we'll probably get to this in terms of how I work, but it can be challenging to
Yeah.
take the time and energy that's actually required to reflect and ask
Mm-hmm.
yourself, what am I feeling? What do I think? It's not something we're necessarily taught. So it's actually a new skill set. Um, and it can lead to kind of that moment of what is what is
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
And that can
Yeah.
be pretty destabilizing until you get back to some solid footing and a connection to yourself, I would argue, is what gives you that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll dive in more and more into that. But before we do, how did you even discover this? For me, I feel like it was just providential or accidental, a miracle of sorts.
Mhm.
And when I met it, when I intersected with it, I was like, this is what I've been looking for.
Mhm.
How about you? How did you first discover it, and how did you respond when you first heard about it?
Yeah, yeah. I was in kind of a seeker era of my life when I came upon it. I had left management consulting. So I had worked for a firm called BCG out of undergrad, and I had my own quarter life crisis really when I decided I wanted to leave that career path and find a new path for myself. And I ended up first at a grad school studying integrative health. And long story short, I ended up deciding I actually wanted to go a little bit deeper and I wanted to really understand, how do we make meaning of the world? Like that was the question that I came to without knowing that CDT is a literal framework for, demonstrating that. And so I was looking at other grad schools and I came upon the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which is Robert Keegan's home base. And he's an academic who, is behind the constructive developmental theory, immunity to change. And I thought, I need to go to where this
Yeah.
body of knowledge was
The
created and
source.
resides. Yeah, I needed to go there.
Yeah.
So I took a leave from one
Yeah.
grad program, applied to Harvard, got in, went out there, and I had the opportunity to study with the professor who's teaching the curriculum now, Deb Helsing. So that's kind of how I encountered it. It was more of like I had these questions, and then I came upon this academic who
Yeah.
was answering them. Um, I will
Yeah.
also say, and we can talk about this later too, I studied religion in undergrad, and I studied
Yeah.
South Asian religion, Hinduism being one
Okay.
of them. And I found a lot of parallels between some of that philosophy and CDT. And
Mm.
the fifth stage, the self-transforming mind, to me is a state of enlightenment, which
Yeah.
this is a more spiritual conversation, but I felt that I had encountered this way of describing human evolution in religious philosophy prior to meeting CDT. So I already had that frame of
Yeah.
understanding our evolution. I just hadn't seen it in a Western academic setting. And I
Yeah.
work with very linear logical people who really want data and research to back up how we're
Yeah.
working together. And so I was like, here it is. Here it is. This is the
Yeah.
evidence behind what I felt I already knew through other self knowledge and also study of um, some religious philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
Hmm.
I can relate to that in the terms of like I think from my own experience and other people that I've talked with that have discovered it, there is like this sense you kind of get pieces, and then this sort of the formal theory kind of pulls those pieces together in a
Hmm.
sense. In the book Immunity to Change, by Robert Keegan, he cites, there's a section in the book where he cites some research on the levels, the maturity levels from the theory in I think in executives, and that research was actually done by Keith Eigel. And so Keith Eigel is how I discovered constructive development theory. He's got a leadership development program here in the Atlanta area called the Leaders Lyceum, and I had a friend that was shooting a video at their facility, and so that was just like a chance encounter that I discovered, what is this place we're shooting at? And then I learned more about it.
Cool.
And they ended up becoming a client, and I've had Keith on the podcast and stuff. So yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Now,
And is Keith who coined can I just ask, is Keith the one who coined the phrase or distinguished between adaptive challenges and technical challenges? Does that ring a bell to you?
Yeah. Well, the way he talks about lateral and vertical development, so he has those phrases. But the one you mentioned, I would have to look at it. So I actually, so Keith wrote a book called The Map. So if anyone wants kind of an entry level to constructive development theory, this is it. But I'd have to look in the book and just see if that's the phrase he uses or not.
It's actually Dr. Ron Heifetz. I just looked it up in a book on my end. Cool. Yeah. So he's somebody else
and
that
what's
has
his
inspired.
Book?
So this is in an Immunity to Change book, but Robert Keegan is quoting him. But he distinguishes between technical and adaptive challenges. Have you heard that framing?
Yeah, I mean, I would have seen it in Immunity to Change when I read it, but I don't know if I've heard it elsewhere. So yeah, I guess define it a little bit more for people that haven't heard it, what it is.
Yeah, I would love to, because I think it's helpful. So a technical challenge is one that can be solved through the acquisition of more information. So a technical challenge is like, I don't know how to build this Excel model to predict, revenues 5 years from now. I can Google that. I can ask my friend, like once I get the information, I can build that model. An adaptive challenge is one that no additional information can solve, but rather an awareness of your setting and an ability to communicate is what will solve it. So say a team is really unmotivated and they have the goals, they have the tools, but they're not making progress. That's an adaptive challenge that for the manager or the leader, they need to both understand themselves and understand the people that they're working with in a different way than they do now. But usually that involves active listening, it involves reflection, it involves conversation. And so things like constructive development theory give us a step-by-step process to actually experience adaptive evolution versus technical evolution, so to speak. So I think it's, if someone's listening to this and they're like, I have all the information at my fingertips, I still can't solve my problem, whether it's about their leadership style or achieving a certain target or having a better relationship with their husband or wife, that's probably an adaptive challenge. And it's just useful to even know, okay, at least I know what kind of challenge I'm facing. Now, maybe ITC or Immunity to Change could be a helpful next step of evolving to meet the challenge. But yeah, I think it's a good distinction to be aware of.
Yeah. So you mentioned, just the dynamics between, from a spiritual, connecting that to the material world through this theory. So when you intersected with it, was it simply just a download of that information, or did it actually help you transform in any particular way as you understood it?
Yeah, both. It was I'm a very practical, tactical person, so I knew it would be really useful for the people that I work with. So I felt very excited about the discovery from that perspective. I also had to be coached through Immunity to Change in order to, graduate from my master's degree. So I had no choice but to evolve. And it did help me, and it helped me I have forever been very similar to my clients, attached to external achievement to validate me internally. And so that was a big immunity that I had, which we can talk more about that, but something that really influenced my decisions and also, is a deep fear of mine of being inadequate. And the way that I got beyond that was looking for external markers of success. And so that was kind of what my Immunity to Change map was all about. And that's an ongoing process.
So you actually had to do it for yourself as part of
I
that
did.
course?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
cool.
Classmates, we coached each other. So we like
Yeah.
went back and forth and had to meet and were the client. And so I have I have some familiarity with my own immunities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
We all have them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was similar when I went through the Leaders Lyceum program
Mm-hmm.
that Keith offers. That's similar. It just wasn't an academic setting, but I had to go through similar exercises as did others. And
Mm-hmm.
and they call it a growth gap tool, but it's similar to the immunity
Mm-hmm.
to change
Mm-hmm.
exercise. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now when when you talk about just that idea of like being outside in defined,
Mm-hmm.
achievements from the external defining you, giving you that
Mm-hmm.
meaning and validation, I kind of immediately thought of the opposite version of that is is actually pioneering or moving into in a direction that those same people would invalidate you. And
Mm-hmm.
so in the sense of like actually moving towards a vision and values that as you kind of say, that kind of give you more alignment,
Mm-hmm.
um, actually has a risk. There's a risk in your
Yes.
social circles to stepping
Mm-hmm.
outside of the accepted, whatever the accepted things are. Talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that and maybe how that connects to what you were saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's intricately connected. And I think most of our maps, most of us as humans, to just talk more broadly outside of even the ITC perspective, we're social creatures, and that goes back to our survival instinct. So if you're the outsider, like back in the day, you're not getting resources, your family's not protected. Like instinctually, we don't want to be the
Mm-hmm.
odd one out.
Yeah.
And for good reason, back to like a survival instinct. We
Yeah.
don't want to be
There is a
left
risk,
without
a real risk.
resources. There is a real risk. Yeah. So that's a big part of our wiring.
Mm-hmm.
And the good news is that today in our modern era, we depend on people for social connection, and that's very important. And also, we're so mobile, we can find new communities. If you don't feel like you belong in the Episcopal Church, again, I'm not Episcopalian, I'm just like
Yeah.
choosing that.
Yeah.
If you feel
Yeah.
like you don't belong there, you have the ability to join a different church. You have the ability to move to a new town. Like there are different options available to us today. So we don't have to operate in that frame of mind, but it's still there in our subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of fear when we feel like we're going against the grain, so to speak, of our existing
Yeah.
community. And so when you do make a decision from the self-authored mind, when you say that doesn't make sense to me, but this actually makes more sense to me, there's going to be a lot of friction.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're truly enlightened and you can, exist in the source of love, you will feel, which most of us are not in that place, and definitely not permanently, you're going to feel fear. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that's also why so many of the greats actually say their secret is feeling the fear and doing it anyways,
Mm-hmm.
because that is back to our human condition. We feel that friction when we leave an established group or a community. And so, and in order to be in alignment with ourselves and the self-authored place that we might get to, that's a necessary feeling and experience. So if anyone's listening and they're like, it feels really uncomfortable to me right now doing what I'm doing, that discomfort is not a sign that you're doing the wrong thing. It is often the sign that you are doing the right thing. And eventually, because we live in such a modern, connected, mobile world, you will actually find a community that affirms the things that you've chosen to do. And that's the beauty too. Like you don't actually have to go it alone, but it will feel uncomfortable
Yeah.
when you're like taking steps 1 to 5, let's say, onto this new path that you might have uncovered.
Yeah, and it comes from the oddest of places. I'll give a kind of a specific example. So I'm a freelancer now. I had a marketing agency for about 7 years and grew it, hired people, and da da da. And I ended up transitioning from that to freelancing. But a lot of business owners have a hard time with freelancers because they want freelancers to run their freelancing the way they run their business.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say, "Hey, Jason, why aren't you hiring people to do these things for you?" And I said, "Well, I've been there and done that. That's not what I want to do." And
Mm-hmm.
um, and so that tension can, and in a lot of cases, it might just be like them trying to give me their advice although it's not relevant. They're trying to help. So it's not necessarily a hostile thing, but they just have a hard time with that dynamic because they've sort of chosen a different paradigm. And that can
Hmm.
manifest in a variety of different contexts. That was just one that came to mind.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
talked about the
And
idea of
mhm,
solarpreneurship, and so
yeah.
dive into that a little bit.
Totally. Yeah. And I just wanted to share like my own example, which is
Yeah.
so funny to look back on. When I left consulting, when I introduced myself to people, I think I introduced myself as ex-BCG for like a year after leaving
Mm,
consulting,
yeah.
because that was still my primary safe identity. And it carried a lot of meaning with it. And I did not have my own safety, you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
in terms of
Yeah.
how is my ego going to be protected? How do I feel good? I didn't feel good enough about myself on my own with that identity to fall back on. And it was so, I
Yeah.
reflected on that later where I'm like, how long did it actually take me to get to the place where I was good with the decision that I had made? Because I was able to make the decision, but then to actually be in like a new space where I had created
Yeah.
a new foundation for myself. It took me about a year because I would identify myself that way. And,
Yeah.
that's also part of the world we live in. There are certain things that are just validated, but I think it's a beautiful thing that there are more and more people doing their own thing, and my clients who are willing to take the risk and start their
Hmm.
own business or join a startup or pivot industries, and people are pivoting more frequently in their jobs. Like I think we're accelerating faster and faster toward a self-authored world where there's
Hmm.
less fear around doing things that make the most sense to you. I think the pandemic accelerated that a lot, where
Hmm.
things just didn't work for them anymore. Like employment just didn't work anymore because they had to take care of their kids at home, or
Yeah.
they weren't able to maintain the lives that they
Yeah.
wanted to. So I'm
And
optimistic
we're
that
still having to yeah, people are
yeah,
still
yeah.
having to process that, even though it's 4 years
Hmm.
past the pandemic. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I hope that the self-authored component of the pandemic, where it forced a lot of us to make the decision that made the most sense for us individually at that time, I hope that validation of the self authoring our choices will continue. I think it's hard
Yeah.
because, again, the social pull and coming back to the office, and there are other things that kind of reinforce the socialized mind. But I do think there was a little bit of a step change that happened for society as a whole toward more stage 4 thinking due to the
Hmm.
pandemic, which just flipped all of our social groups on their heads.
Yes.
Yeah.
I relate to that idea of our society is going through that transition. And it's very chaotic, for sure.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things I realized, that I don't know if this is your experience too, but when I shut down my company in 2014 and transitioned to freelancing, that was a big. It was. I was going through that transition. It was hugely disruptive, chaotic, ultimately just super fruitful. And so when the pandemic hit, I was expecting to have to go through another transition, but it turned out that the transition I had already gone through had prepared me for the one that was coming.
Hmm.
How about you? How did you feel about that when the pandemic hit?
Yeah. It was so interesting because I was actually running a different business called
Yeah,
Rise, which was a community for women in early career in male dominated
yeah.
spaces. So I felt
Oh,
very strongly about creating, like, back to the community piece. Like, because I felt working in consulting in a, more male dominated industry, more
yeah.
male clients, et cetera. Um, that I didn't fit in, and that almost worked. I mean, it did work against me. Like it created an
Yeah.
additional burden that I was carrying, kind of always rectifying, like, do I belong here? Was
Hmm.
in the back of my mind. Even though I did well, I got promoted as quickly as I could have been, like all the external signs were saying you're doing great. There was this
Yeah.
additional burden. And so we don't have to get into Rise too much, but that's why I built Rise. We had
Yeah.
850 members. We were in 15 cities, and we were doing in-person pop-up events. So the women in the male dominated offices
Yeah.
could actually have the community to see, oh, yeah, we belong here. I see you doing the same thing as me. My experience does not need to be a burden that I'm trying to resolve all the time, because I
Mm,
actually have my companions here in this space in Rise, because they were from different companies connecting with each other. Um, so I ended up shutting that business down midsummer. So like August 2020, we
oh
shut down
wow.
because most of our events were in person. That was our primary
Yeah.
membership driver. I was a solo founder, and I was burning myself out. And, there was just a lot there was a lot
Yeah.
there to consider. We can talk later about, when you choose to move forward with a business versus shut it down. But then I started working just individually with one-on-one clients. And that fall of 2020, my business like exploded and has been my individual career pivot business. And that's been since that point, booked and busy. And for
Yeah.
me, that was like, I didn't do the transition pre-pandemic. I did it like
Oh,
because
so
of
you
the
did it at the
pandemic.
same time. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so for me, that was really valuable to be pushed to go back to just me serving my
Hmm.
community.
Yeah.
Um, but I still, I really believe in the mission of Rise and the
Yeah.
idea of creating community for those who are feeling that what we just talked about,
Yeah.
like the socialized to the self-authored, like how do you give people the safety to step off the
Yeah.
track or stay in a place that feels so in conflict
Yeah.
with them. So I love
Well,
that there are some other startups building in that space. So I think I
yeah.
hope someone continues to build that.
I mean, do you feel like the group thing was like a launching pad for you to do like to make that transition? Like if you hadn't had it, would it have been a lot harder or maybe not even have happened? Like were they necessarily tethered together?
So I wouldn't say they were tethered because I was coaching for a few years before I
Hmm.
built Rise. So Rise was
Yeah.
kind of like an evolution of my coaching. But I will say back to my personal immunity, I did have a value to that I was placing on my individual coaching work that was less than building a scalable startup. Like to be a
Okay.
founder of a startup at scale to me was more valid and worth more praise and better than running a solo business.
Hmm.
For whatever reason, I think because it receives more publicity. I was in this, Harvard incubator, like it was sexier. There was more attention given to it. Um, so I think being forced to really consider do I want to do this? Does this make the most sense for me? Is this the best way for me to create the impact in the world that I want to? And saying no at this time it's not was me forcing myself to let go of the thing that was giving me safety,
Yeah.
that was proving
Yeah.
my worth. Oh, Julia's
Okay.
building this startup. That makes Julia worthy
Yeah.
of love and respect and admiration or whatever it might be. I had to go through that again. Like I did it once leaving BCG.
Mm,
I did another time I was working in a family business that I left. That was another moment where I had to self
yeah.
author. Shutting down Rise was the self authoring moment. So it's hard to totally unwire, but to be
Yeah.
aware of what's driving our decisions and give ourselves options outside of that and give ourselves the validation that we're
Yeah.
craving from whatever socialized choice we're making is like, I think a big part of my secret sauce of being able to pivot as I've learned new information about what's
Hmm.
best for me. Mm-hmm.
So connect that to with us to the idea of inside out versus outside in.
Mm-hmm.
And you're really focusing on the inside out with your clients
Mm-hmm.
and the people you coach and the leaders you coach.
Yeah.
But they're probably at that moment where they maybe want to make that transition. They're thinking about it. Maybe they're in the middle of it. Maybe they need help
Mm-hmm.
on the outside of it. Connect those dots for us.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. So what I do is help people build that relationship with themselves and the self knowledge that gives you the foundation to be more self authoring. So for me, I don't even necessarily talk about immunity to change or CDT explicitly with every one of my clients, but that's what we're doing is shifting
Yeah.
from stage 3 to stage 4. And I do it through core values and strengths. So
Hmm.
I help people to just get in touch with themselves. What do I uniquely value? What
Yeah.
am I uniquely good at? And just even the pause of taking a step back from, I work with a lot of
Hmm.
people like myself, like external achievers. They've been on the track of what is it that's hardest and most valuable to achieve. That is what I am going to do without
Mm,
really thinking about why. Why are you motivated to do that? Do you enjoy the process of doing that?
yeah.
And so I give people the opportunity to pause and just reflect too on their lives so far. What's driven me up to this point? And based on what I've learned, what do I want to drive me moving forward? So we do that from values and strengths. And then it's a framework and a kind of I don't try to facilitate a quarter or midlife crisis, but sometimes that happens when it's like,
Yeah.
now let's talk about your core values and how
Yeah.
much you're living in alignment with them now. And they
Mhm.
might be like, shoot, not much, like this is why I feel burnt out. This is why I feel
Mhm.
so angsty every day going
Yep.
to my job, my prestigious, well-paying job that I should be very grateful for, but I'm not. And so that's the moment
Yeah.
where they get to say, okay, typically I want to be more in alignment with my values.
Mhm.
I can't live like this anymore. And then we talk through what could that
Yeah.
look like. Yeah.
And I imagine they establish clarity on their values and have clarity on their strengths, and
Hmm.
they want to move towards that. But there's a giant, ugly troll under the bridge. So how do you help them through that
Hmm.
step?
Yeah, the ugly troll in my world is usually the judgment that they assume is going to come upon them if they change. Yeah. So I work with very linear logical people. So a lot of it is repetition and a lot of it is intellectualizing. Okay, what are the feelings that come up for you when you think
Yeah.
about leaving? When you think about telling your network that you're becoming a freelancer or
Yeah.
whatever would be the next step for them that they're hesitating on.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that step is actually networking. So when they
Mm,
have to actually go out into the world and tell somebody that they're looking for a role in this industry or that they're considering leaving this job or this
yeah.
career that they've spent 15 years building. I work with
Yeah.
doctors and lawyers and people who it's a big deal. It feels
Yeah.
very scary and very risky
Yep.
to give that path up, not only for themselves, but everyone who's ever validated them along the way,
Hmm.
typically
Yeah.
friends, family, colleagues. And so this goes back actually to CDT and immunity to change, whether they know it or not. We design what in that context is called a test. So we think about what is the scary thing? What is the risk that you're perceiving? And how do we test that in a very safe context?
Mm.
So if it feels really scary to tell your wife that you're leaving the firm, okay, could you tell your best friend who you know is not going to judge you? But can you like say it out loud to somebody? And then what is your fear? Oh, they're going to judge you. They're going to view you as less. How do we collect information about what
Hmm.
they actually think? Like,
Yeah.
how do they respond? Can you ask them some questions along the way of like, are you surprised by this? Like, do you think this is a good idea? And getting the feedback from the people in your life is typically the best way to neutralize those big, scary trolls under the bridge. Because
Yeah.
it's a belief, it's an assumption. If I do this, then the world
Yeah.
ends. So how do you
Yeah.
do that in like baby steps and see
Yep.
that typically the world doesn't end? Typically people are actually very excited and inspired by
Yeah.
you taking those risks. And
Hmm.
probably more people than you know in your
Like,
network have
yeah.
something like that that they also want to do. Who knows what it is,
Yeah.
but there's something that they're not doing because they're afraid of what
Yeah.
other people might think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good and inspiring, and I hope someone that hears that is inspired too. Um, and I think that idea of like start with a small safe context and then kind of build out, grow from there.
Hmm.
And like don't actually go to the bridge where there's like three trolls and they're really big. Maybe don't go to that one first. Maybe start with
Yeah.
a one that there's not
Yeah.
actually a troll, it's just a bridge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And there's something about knowing who to ask for advice from too. Again, like most people that
Mm,
I work with are very well supported by mentors, by sponsors, by people in their workplace that maybe have guided them up until this point. But
mm-hmm.
if you know what they're going to
Yeah.
say and you know they're not going to approach this with curiosity, that might not be the first person that you go to. So you might have to
Yeah.
approach this in a different. And the one other thing that I wanted to share from what I do is I do a friend survey with all my clients. So
Like a
that's
360 feedback kind of thing.
kind of, but it's just to friends and family and people who know you well.
Yeah.
It could include colleagues, but it doesn't have to.
Okay.
And there are things
Yeah.
like, if you had to pay me today to solve a problem for you, what kind of problem would you pay me to solve? If you
Okay.
had to
Yeah.
describe me to someone who's never met me, what are the three words you'd use? If
Yeah.
you had to put me into a different job tomorrow, what would that
Hmm.
job be? Like, and
Yeah.
getting that feedback from your community is amazingly liberating. It's
Yeah.
unreal. And like, how often do we have the chance to ask the people who care about
Uh-huh.
us most, that love us and know us the best,
Mhm.
what their perception of us is? It's just so validating, especially for
Yeah.
people who are tending to be harder on themselves
Yeah.
and, looking for their weaknesses. Like, let some other people build you up. And it gives you, again, it just starts like, yeah, the work is slowly opening doors. It's not the coach who says, I will change your life overnight. Like, no,
Yeah.
without cursing, no,
It's a
that's
long,
not possible.
repetitive
Yeah.
process. Yeah. And a
It's
lot
a
of
long,
practice.
repetitive process. Yeah. And it can happen. Like, you can have these light bulbs that are like, wow, I see things
Hmm.
differently quickly. But in terms of changing your behavior, like, it's going to take
Yeah.
3 months minimum, probably 12 to 24 months to really be like, I'm in a completely new life where I
Yeah.
actually feel different and understand myself differently. But it starts with these baby steps. So you have
Yeah.
to start, but the expectation that it's going to be like that is just, unless you're maybe taking some like psilocybin or something, which I don't have experience with, but maybe there are things now that you can do that can rewire your brain more quickly. But in the line of work that I do, it takes a little bit of time. Not a lot of time, but it takes
Yeah.
some time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the work you're doing, the work when I went through the Leaders Lyceum program. I mean, one of the things that they talk about it, they kind of frame it like, hey, in 2 years, you're going to grow as an adult. What if you could compact that down to 6 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what you're trying to say is like, we can accelerate this by leaning into these dynamics that actually lead to growth versus avoiding them, which is what we might want to tend to do when we're in that level
Yes.
3 stage.
Yeah. And you cannot grow for a lifetime too. If you don't
Yeah.
want to, you can stay in stage 3 for your whole entire life. I think it's like 15% of the population's in stage 4, and then like less than 1% is in stage 5. So that
Hmm.
means that 85% of the population is in the socialized mind.
Yeah.
So that's huge.
But that's our
And
opportunity
exactly.
to step into that leadership
Yes.
vacuum that we now have to actually
Yes.
en masse become leaders for our
Yes.
communities and
Exactly.
work and home and family.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that is truly the opportunity. I love that you said that, because just like, yeah, what if you were one of the people in the self-authored mind in your
Yeah.
organization? You might be one of a handful of people who are operating that way, but your ideas will be better. You'll be a better leader. You'll be able to
Hmm.
relate to people better because you're outside of your own socialized perception. You can see more different viewpoints and
Yeah.
perspectives. It's hugely powerful if you can get there.
Yeah. So on that note, kind of help us understand, you say there are benefits to vulnerability and curiosity, which I agree. A lot of
Hmm.
people may say, well, no, 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 no. So
Hmm.
make a case for why those are important.
Yeah. Yeah. It all goes back to the self-knowledge piece.
Okay.
And so I would say vulnerability and curiosity. I think when people hear them, especially vulnerability, they think with somebody else. Like, I need to make myself vulnerable to somebody else, like in a
Okay.
relationship, in a team, whatever. But I would say vulnerability starts between you and you.
Hmm.
And that's almost the most vulnerable you will ever be, is when you can acknowledge to yourself who you actually are and
Yeah.
how you're actually operating. Um, so yeah, vulnerability to me is just honesty. And it has to start with you being honest with yourself about who you are, how you're making decisions, how you're motivated. And it's important because if you can't be aware of where you're starting from, you can't make progress from there. Like, you're kind of just operating with make believe
Hmm.
if you're not able to
Hmm.
share first with yourself and then maybe with other people over time. Like, hey, this is where I'm at.
Yeah.
This is my experience. Um, and it is, when you're vulnerable, you allow other people to be vulnerable, even if you're just sharing your own story. That's why, testimony in a church or in like an AA meeting or in so
Yeah.
many personal development spaces, like, testimony is a big part. It's not someone telling anyone else what they need to do. It's just them sharing their own
Hmm.
experience. And that is, if you're ready and you feel like you've gotten to this state of like, I'm at least as honest as I can be with myself about myself. Now I can share that story with somebody else. You don't have to facilitate their growth, but you sharing your vulnerability gives them the moment to be like, oh, maybe I need to get honest with myself about myself.
Yeah.
So that's, it's all part of the evolution. If you don't know where you're starting from, you can't go anywhere, period.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down
Well,
to.
and just from my own experience, in terms of sharing your story, there are just so many people in my life that have guided or mentored me that they shared first. They gave me
Mm-hmm.
permission to share second, and
Yeah.
that was very empowering at times when I couldn't have shared first. I needed
Mm-hmm.
someone else to kind of open the door of vulnerability, so then I could express and share my own
Yeah.
insecurities as a way to know, like, this is a safe place to share.
Mm-hmm.
Because sharing in the wrong place in that time could just shut me down further, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's also what coaching is about.
Mm,
I do my absolute best to create safety for the people that I work with. And I even tell people in the intake, what I'm looking for is someone who can be honest with themselves. Because if you can't be honest with yourself first, you can't be honest with me. You can't be honest with me. We don't even know what we're working with.
yeah.
Um, but it's rare. We do live in a bit of a violent society and a scared
Yeah.
society. And when you're scared, if you see a threat, if you see something that doesn't align with your experience, the knee-jerk reaction is to shut it down or
Yeah.
diminish it or discard it or criticize it. And that's so damaging, to your point of, like, if you're vulnerable with someone who's not ready to hear that, that is incredibly traumatizing.
Hmm.
And I don't think that we can overlook how much trauma people
Yeah.
experience, period, and then how rare it is to actually be in a dynamic where you can be vulnerable and you can admit your flaws. Like, you can talk about
Yeah.
the things that you're most worried about being judged
Yeah.
on. Like, that's incredibly healing. If you
Yeah.
have a space where you
Hmm.
can say, hey, I did this thing that I'm not proud of, and you're met with someone who says, that's okay,
Hmm.
and you
We
have
love
been
you anyway.
carrying
We
all this
accept you.
shame
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, we love you no
Yeah.
matter what.
Yeah.
It's okay, me too. Like,
Yeah.
that experience, I wish everyone on planet Earth could have that experience of sharing
Yeah.
what it is that they feel worst about about themselves,
Yeah.
and it was met with love. Like, that would heal the world. Not to get hippie,
Yeah.
but, like, that
Oh
would
yeah.
truly heal the world. And I just also want to acknowledge, for anyone listening who's tried that and not gotten that response, it doesn't mean you can't get that response from a different source. And just
Mm,
finding the spaces where you can get that response is almost our job, to put ourselves into environments
yeah.
where we're going to be met with love and understanding and support and encouragement. It's
Yeah.
not easy to find, but it exists, and everyone deserves to have that experience, and that's what we all want. Like, no one's
Yeah.
unique in, like, needing that space. We all need
Yeah.
that space, right? We're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and I got the opportunity to interview a man named Daryl Davis, and he's a black man who reaches out to people in the KKK. He goes to their
Wow.
rallies, and he
Wow.
does exactly what you are describing with them, with sort of these people that know essentially everyone's discarded. And
Mhm.
I think he's got like several hundred KKK robes that members have given him as they've left
Wow.
the group, and it's just very inspiring. And I'm thinking, man, if he can do that, I can do at least something in that direction,
Mhm. Totally.
be that for those people that seem, I mean, not that it's not that he's accommodating or um, saying what they're saying is right, but and he brings in truth, but he also has that grace side of it,
Mhm.
and so
Mhm.
that's pretty inspiring.
It
Um,
is.
so is
Yeah.
that an
And
is
I
yeah, go
would
ahead.
I would just also, like, that's an incredible example. That's so inspiring, and it makes me pause and think, what could I do that would be that
Hmm.
transformational? And the people that we interact with every single day, like, again, our spouses, our
Yep.
kids, the PTA president, like the person who's parking behind you, the
Yeah.
barista, like, they all have
Something.
stuff
Yeah.
that they're carrying around. And I think we're all very, very quick to judge, and especially if we're kind of dysregulated and stressed ourselves. So if anyone's
Yeah.
listening and hears that, it's like, whoa, I can't do that. The thing is, you can do that. You can do that level of holding space for anyone in your life
Yeah.
today. And that can heal. And it can also feel so good. Like
Yeah.
you have to tap into that
Hmm.
peace and understanding in order to give it to
Yeah.
somebody else. So it can happen in any context. Yeah.
And I think that the contrast to what you're talking about, so you're talking about vulnerability and honesty. The opposite of that is kind of closed off and dishonest or self-deceived.
Hmm.
Talk to us a little bit about that, and perhaps even the transition between that to the ideal state, away from that
Hmm.
jadedness, um,
Hmm.
towards a place of healing.
Yeah. The people that I encounter are are typically oriented to that socialized group. So they're not, I don't think that most of them have had the experience of being honest with themselves to know that they're really shutting that down. They
Hmm.
just haven't even gotten there yet. And they think that how they've been making decisions makes total sense until maybe, the last year or something where they've started to be like,
Mm-hmm.
this is hurting me. So it can't make sense anymore. I'm burned out. I don't have the right
Hmm.
relationships, whatever it might be.
The real
Um,
world consequences. Yeah.
yeah, are kicking in. So they have to investigate it. But again, just to have that, I think empathy is also hugely important for us to be able to be like, we make decisions with as much information as we know. So I think that shutdown, it's a very natural progression actually to end up in the socialized group. That's where
Yeah.
we learn norms and values and acceptable behaviors
Yeah.
and have social connections. And so I think most people are there, but then they never have the push
Mm.
to expand beyond that. And so
Okay. Yeah.
I wouldn't say sometimes I think it's just this slow awareness of, oh, there's something else here that I'm not acknowledging because I don't know how to acknowledge it in a safe way.
Yeah.
But I think we have to grow up. First, we have to
Hmm.
be in the socialized group and experience the world typically through the safety of a socialized group. Like, oh, I'm going to go on a mission trip with
Yeah.
my church. And so I'm going to go to whatever country. And then after I go there, I'm like, wait, like, were we helping? Were we hurting? I don't know. But like, you had to go there with your social group to get the
Yeah.
information to force you to become a little bit more
Hmm.
self-authored. So I do think it's more of a natural progression. And I really don't like to have like not that you're doing this, but just in general, like the CDT formula and like it is a bit of a hierarchy. And I think that can be a little harmful or almost like, oh, I'm going to look
Mm.
down on the people who are stuck in
Yeah.
stage 3. I don't think that is accurate. I think it's a very natural evolution, and the social groups of our lives are
Yeah.
very important. So I think
Yeah.
I might be speaking to something other than your question, but I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
the people who come to me are just starting to feel like, oh, there's something else here. There's some other knowledge, conclusion, drive, desire that I don't quite know what to do with because it doesn't fit
Yeah.
in where I've
Yeah.
been. But it's less of having shut themselves down to that point, and it's more of just being at that stage where they're ready to go to whatever's
Yeah.
next. So they don't know how to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. And I do, Jennifer Garvey Berger actually does a great job of talking about the stages in a way that doesn't create a superiority dynamic that I
Hmm.
think you're talking about can
Yeah.
manifest. And I think something to keep in mind is that each stage has its own limitations, and we can learn from each other in different stages things within our wherever we are. And
Hmm.
so a blind spot for someone in a level 4 might be a different type of blind spot than someone in level 3 versus someone in level 2, but they're all going to have the blind spots.
Hmm.
And so to forget that, would be a big deficiency, I think.
Hmm. Yeah. And to that point, there is a level 5.
Yeah.
There is a
Yeah.
stage beyond level 4, which it's called self-transforming. And this is where I think it gets more into the philosophical side. But what stage 5 recognizes is that we are interdependent.
Hmm.
So self-authoring is I'm independent.
Yeah.
The self-transforming is recognizing, no, I'm actually interdependent. I am an independent being, and I also rely
Hmm.
on everyone else in the world. Like
Yeah.
I take as much. Yeah, go ahead.
And I would say including people we may not think we are dependent on.
Yes.
Particularly people that are a very low, like I'll just use America as an example. Like there are a lot of products and things we create in China that are probably created by people at the bottom of the class system.
Mm-hmm.
And we're dependent on them, right? We may not even know it or see it or think about it. But
Mm-hmm.
just to give a quick example, like I may think I'm like independent and I can live my own life and I don't need those people, but I do.
Yeah.
They're part of me.
And even the people you drive on the highway next to every day. Like we depend on them respecting us and respecting the rules of the road and not taking a violent action. You know, we rely on each other in every single aspect of our lives. We could not do this on our own. Maybe some people could survive out in the woods. I don't know if you've ever watched Alone, the like survival show. At the end of the day, people can be out there for a long time, but usually they come to like, I just want to see my wife. I just want to see my son.
Mm-hmm.
Like life isn't worth it if I don't have people here with me. And so that interdependence can't be overlooked.
Yeah. So kind of talk a little bit more about that, because that autonomy narrative, I think, is a prominent one in America, but also pretty destructive, I think, in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the autonomy narrative, probably the biggest harm it does is it gives us like an excuse to avoid resolving relationships.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that's an interesting take. Yeah.
And I mean, just to expand on it, I think that we have this independence bias, obviously, and like pull yourself up by your bootstraps in the States, and the Lone Ranger out like seeking his fortune out west or whatever. And yeah, I think for me, relationships are where I grow the most. Friendships, romantic relationships, familial relationships, because they force you to be honest with yourself about who you are and how you're acting. Like if you just live in a bubble and you just read books and play video games and like I love to read fantasy, like I'm guilty of escapism just like the next person. But if that's 100% where you live, like I do think that's an avoidance. So the autonomy narrative, I'm not sure, like the healthy aspects are, okay, I can exercise critical thinking, come to my own conclusions. But I think that we miss a lot of what is very life-giving, which is community, recognize interdependence, helping, and being able to ask for help. So I think in general, that's a non-generative narrative of you need to do it on your own, or I'm going to do it on my own. I think that hobbles you more than anything. Yeah,
that's great. Well, I guess as we wrap up here, let's say someone's listening to this and they're like, wow, I really connected with Julia. I'm interested in learning more. How can I learn more? How can I work with you? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I would love to connect to anyone who's resonated with this conversation. Even if you have another question about it or want some reading materials, like please reach out to me. I'm on social media at Julia Starr Coaching on Instagram, TikTok, on LinkedIn. I'm active on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. I just love being connected to people who are also thinking about the world in this way. And if you want to work with me individually, I have an individual coaching practice one-on-one, and I take people on every single month, depending on availability. So if that's something someone's interested in, just reach out to me and I'll send you more information about that.
Cool. Yeah. What are your final farewell thoughts for us as we leave the listener or the watcher on their merry way? What do you want to tell them?
Yeah, I just want people to be excited about the opportunity to learn more about themselves and live on Earth for the brief moment that we have. I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to quote unquote do well and achieve the most. But I think there's a lot to be said for enjoying the opportunities we have and the people that we're with, and to not overlook how nourishing those things are for us and how much they do fuel our achievement, but that achievement alone cannot sustain a life. Yeah.
Well, Julia, thank you so much for sharing your life and your expertise with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, this was wonderful. Thanks so much for bringing me on.